Police believed 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 Whitby had something to hide in the weeks following the death of her son, Emerson. That's what officers said when they questioned her the day after she was arrested and charged.
Unfortunately, justice doesn't always work the way it should. For prosecutors Adam Brecker and Ali Sparks, this case may have just been another failure in their careers. But for little Emerson Whitby, it was a heartbreaking example of a system that let him down. The 18-month-old never got the protection he needed, and his family was left with painful, unanswered questions, though some may not even want to know the truth. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to say how much I appreciate all of you. Seeing this community grow every day is truly moving, and I love reading your comments. Let me know where you're watching from. It really inspires me. And if you want to support the channel, consider subscribing or becoming a sponsor to help raise awareness about cases like this. Now, let's go back to the story of Emerson Whitby. 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 Whitby and Riley Jolly had an on and off relationship, and even 𝐃𝐶's pregnancy couldn't fix that. Shortly before their baby was born, they finally decided to separate, but agreed to share custody. Emerson William Brian Whitby was born on December 2, 2018, in Regina, Canada. He was a bright, happy little boy, always smiling and full of energy. His family lovingly called him Buggy because he was constantly on the move, crawling around the house, exploring everything. Even as he started walking, so fast that his grandmothers could barely keep up, the nickname stuck. Riley was an involved father, regularly spending time with his son. As Emerson grew, Riley started taking him to his own home 1 or 2 days a week, as well as every other weekend. Meanwhile, 𝐃𝐶 had moved on and started dating a man named Taylor Stewart. Taylor had previously worked in Estevan in the oil industry, but had lost his job. He later moved to Regina for work, and in September 2019, married the mother of his 2 daughters. However, by January 2020, his marriage had fallen apart, and he and his wife separated. He soon started seeing 𝐃𝐶 more often, and by the end of March, he had moved into her apartment. At the time, Taylor had been living with his parents, which made it difficult for him to have his daughters stay over due to a family member with health concerns. 𝐃𝐶 had no problem with Taylor bringing his daughters into their home, and soon the girls were visiting often. They adored little Buggy and loved playing with him. Neighbors would sometimes hear the sounds of kids playing from 𝐃𝐶's apartment, just the usual noises of childhood. But by mid-April 2020, things took a concerning turn. Emerson's father, Riley, started noticing bruises on his son's ribs. He became worried and began documenting them. Over the next few weeks, more injuries appeared. Bruises on Emerson's ear, cheek, and eye, and even a bald spot on the top of his head. What made Riley uneasy was that 𝐃𝐶 had always informed him when Emerson got hurt. But this time, she hadn't said anything, and he had to ask her directly. When he did, 𝐃𝐶 brushed off his concerns, reassuring him that everything was fine. Then, on May 26, 2020, Riley went to pick up his son again, and what he saw horrified him. Emerson had 2 swollen, dark bruises around his eyes. 𝐃𝐶 claimed he had fallen out of his crib. Not knowing what to do, Riley took his son to his own mother, Darla Jolly, who was just as shocked. She took photos of Emerson's injuries and advised Riley to take him to a doctor. When they went to the pediatrician, the doctor warned that if the swelling got worse, Emerson needed to go to the hospital. Later that day, when Riley saw the bruising becoming more severe, he called 𝐃𝐶, insisting that they take Emerson to the hospital. But 𝐃𝐶 argued against it, saying it wasn't necessary. According to her, black eyes always looked worse before they healed. Riley hesitated. He was afraid that if he went against 𝐃𝐶's wishes, she might try to take his son away from him. Instead, he reached out to social services, providing them with photos of Emerson's injuries. An investigation was launched. Police arrived at 𝐃𝐶's apartment to speak with her. When they arrived, they found her crying in the parking lot, leaning on Taylor for support. The officers also immediately noticed the visible bruises on Emerson's face. Following the investigation, Emerson was temporarily placed in the care of his grandmother, 𝐿isa Virtue, 𝐃𝐶's mother. But just days later, on June 3rd, authorities decided to return the toddler to his mother, under the condition that Chelsea check in with her mother daily. During questioning, Chelsea explained that she hadn't taken Emerson to the hospital because she was afraid of taking him to the hospital due to health concerns at the time. She claimed the bruises were simply from him learning to walk, saying he was an active child who often bumped into things. She also mentioned that he bruised easily and had taken him to the doctor to check if he had an iron deficiency. However, there was one injury Chelsea couldn't explain: the healing fracture in Emerson's ribs, which doctors discovered during his hospital visit. When pressed about it, she guessed it might have happened when he fell down the steps outside her mother's house. Less than a week after Emerson was back in Chelsea's care, Riley went to pick up his son for another visit. As soon as he saw Emerson, he noticed something was off. The little boy was irritable, fussing and crying during the car ride home. But since Emerson usually got fussy when he was hungry, Riley didn't think too much of it. At least, not yet. Later that day, Emerson spent time with his father, Riley, and his grandmother, Darla Jolly. Both noted that he seemed to be his usual energetic self throughout the day. However, as evening approached, Emerson suddenly seemed to lose all of his energy, becoming unusually upset before his nap and refusing his bath. Behavior that was out of character for the usually happy toddler. That night, Riley took Emerson back to Chelsea's house around 8:30 p.m. As they entered the apartment, Emerson unexpectedly started to feel unwell. Riley helped clean up the situation before leaving, and Chelsea called her mother, Lisa, to help get Emerson settled for the night. The next morning, June 10th, Chelsea and her partner, Taylor, woke up around 8:15 a.m., as did Taylor's daughters. Chelsea checked the baby monitor, which showed that Emerson had rolled over, and they decided to let him sleep in. Given that he had gone to bed later than usual and had felt unwell the night before, they thought perhaps the milk in his bottle had upset his stomach, so they planned to pick up some fresh milk later. Around 9:30 a.m., Taylor went to the store to buy milk and other items, returning at 10:00 a.m. Upon entering the apartment, Taylor was met with Chelsea rushing downstairs with Emerson in her arms, clearly distressed, and saying that he wasn't breathing. Taylor immediately began performing emergency procedures while Chelsea called 911. The emergency responders arrived quickly and managed to stabilize Emerson. Tragically, by the time they reached the hospital, it was determined that Emerson had suffered irreversible damage to his brain. At the hospital, doctors discovered several injuries, including numerous bruises on his body. The cause of death was found to be a severe head injury resulting from blunt force trauma. The medical team confirmed that the swelling on his head was significant, with substantial bleeding in one area of the skull, which had likely occurred very recently. They also found signs of similar injuries from previous incidents, indicating a pattern of harm. The medical staff made it clear that the injuries could not have been self-inflicted. Despite the obvious signs of harm, the investigation moved slowly. Chelsea was eventually charged in connection with Emerson's death in August 2020. Before becoming a suspect, Chelsea had already hired a lawyer, which raised concerns among investigators. She explained that her lawyer's involvement was suggested by her mother, as they were worried about the situation. Initially, the authorities considered the possibility of an intruder being responsible for Emerson's condition, but Chelsea did not seem to focus on identifying any such person. Instead, they noted that she seemed more concerned with deflecting suspicion and emphasizing the theory that Emerson's injuries might have been caused by an accident while he was asleep. When questioned, Chelsea said she had no idea what happened to her son and that nothing unusual had been heard. During her interview with the police, her history with anxiety and depression was brought up. She mentioned that she had been receiving treatment for postpartum mental health concerns, but denied any involvement in her son's injuries, and even asked for a lie detector test, though she chose not to take it on her lawyer's advice. When asked about Emerson's injuries, Chelsea provided several explanations. She suggested that the bruises on his sides were caused by rough play with Taylor's daughters, and that the bald spot on his head could be a medical condition. She claimed that the bruises on his face came from an accidental fall while he was looking out a window, and that the black eyes resulted from a fall caused by a malfunctioning bed rail. However, these explanations didn't fully account for the severity of the injuries, particularly the bruising around his eyes. Taylor was interviewed twice, and he provided details about the morning of Emerson's death. He mentioned that Emerson had not been feeling well the previous day. When asked about discipline in the household, Taylor recalled only one instance when 𝐶𝐨𝐬 had gently reprimanded Emerson for trying to open a drawer. During his second interview, Taylor was informed that the only people in the house that night were the ones considered as potential suspects: 𝐶𝐶𝐬, Taylor, and his daughters, though the girls were not seen as suspects. When Taylor realized he was being considered a suspect, he expressed surprise and agreed to take a polygraph test, which was scheduled for later in July. However, on the same day as the polygraph, the community was shaken by the unexpected news that Taylor Stewart had passed away. The police initially suspected suicide, which seemed odd. Taylor was not under suspicion, being young, with a close family, and a love for hunting and fishing. Those who knew him described him as mentally stable. However, he left behind notes for his family, expressing that he had struggled with depression for years. The night before his death, according to an intercepted phone call, Taylor returned to 𝐶𝐶𝐬's apartment around 4 a.m. They spoke outside before he left again around 5 a.m. That was the last time 𝐶𝐶𝐬 saw him alive. His truck was later found in a remote rural area of 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞, and his body was discovered some distance away. Even after Taylor's tragic passing, 𝐶𝐶𝐬 did not attempt to shift blame onto him for Emerson's death. Police had tapped her phone and heard her speaking to a psychic, where she mentioned feeling responsible for Taylor's death. She also expressed concerns that the police might try to blame Emerson's death on him. During another phone call, 𝐶𝐶𝐬 advised Taylor not to speak to the police and reassured him after he said he had agreed to take a polygraph. Taylor's story remained consistent, even during the trial. It's clear that Emerson began suffering injuries shortly after Taylor moved into the home, and it's a stark fact that Taylor took his own life just before he was to undergo the polygraph. Taylor's death left a significant gap in the investigation of Emerson Whitby's case. Emerson's grandmother, 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐿, mentioned that the child bruised easily, something she attributed to the nature of being a young boy. Lisa had suggested that 𝐶𝐶𝐬 keep a diary of any accidents, and she did not remember seeing the same bruises on Emerson's face the night before his death. 𝐶𝐶𝐬 was released after her first appearance in court on August 6, 2020. The trial progressed slowly, and it wasn't until 2023 that the main hearing began. The defense argued that Emerson's subdural hemorrhage was caused by a previous injury rather than recent trauma. They suggested that the injury was accidental, a rebleed, and not caused by any intentional harm from 𝐶𝐶𝐬. However, even if it was a rebleed, the original trauma had to have occurred at some point. The prosecution argued that the brain bleed and subsequent cardiac arrest happened shortly before paramedics were called. They believed 𝐶𝐶𝐬 had been frustrated with Emerson and had lashed out physically, causing the blunt force injury. Patrick Earnshaw, who had dated 𝐶𝐶𝐬 in 2018-2019, was called to testify. He recalled an incident when Emerson had been crying while 𝐶𝐶𝐬 was breastfeeding, and he witnessed her make a backhanded swat at Emerson out of desperation. Though he said it was the only concerning incident related to 𝐶𝐶𝐬's parenting, it raised questions. Emerson's father, Riley, also testified. He recalled a time in early 2020 when 𝐶𝐶𝐬 had become frustrated with getting Emerson to bed. She had reportedly shoved his head into a pillow, but no injuries resulted from this. Riley also noted a bruise on Emerson's forehead that hadn't been there the day before, further raising concerns. The trial ultimately ended with disappointing news. The prosecution's evidence was deemed inadmissible, and the judge ruled that there were reasonable alternatives to explain Emerson's death that did not involve 𝐶𝐶𝐬 intentionally harming him. As a result, the charges of second-degree murder and manslaughter were dropped. Justice Catherine Durson determined that the Crown had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge pointed to two key facts. First, after hours of police interrogation, 𝐶𝐶𝐬 continued to maintain her innocence. And second, there was nothing in her wiretapped conversations that directly implicated her. Despite the court's decision, the question remains, who is truly responsible for Emerson's death? Our sincere condolences go out to Emerson's family. Rest in peace, little angel.